Up next is Jamie Wolfond. Welcome, Jamie. Take it away.
Hello. Hello. Hi, guys. Thank you so much, Emily and Allison. Thank you to Core77 and ADO for having me. My name is Jamie Wolfond. I'm a product designer, and these are some of the things that I've designed. And I'm also the founder of the New York and Toronto-based homewares and furniture brand Good Thing. And these are some of the things that we make. And I'm here to talk about good objects, good products, and the place where those two things intersect. And to explain where I'm coming from with this kind of weird dichotomy, I've put together a very, very mathematically accurate Venn diagram that will show you that intersection. And as you can see, I have come to realize that this intersection is a very small place. Very small. But before we go any further, I think we'd better define these two terms, good object, good product. And so for me, a good object is something that is beautiful, interesting, reliable, and conceptually accessible. Whereas a good product is something that is recognizable, easy to make, novel, and inexpensive. So this is how, over the last several years, I have come to see these two different sets of values as very, very separate things. One driven by the academic and intellectual design world, and the other driven by the ever more powerful market for consumer goods. And what I want to do today is show you how I eventually found these two sides not to be mutually exclusive. So here's the story. I graduated from design school feeling not so thrilled about the things that were on the market, particularly on this continent. And just about everything being made was created, not surprisingly, so that somebody could make as much money as possible. And for that reason, the search for a truly good object had long since stagnated. And the things that I saw around me and the things that unfortunately we continue to see around us are things like these. And these are things that are made to be purchased, but not so much made to be valued, and certainly not made to be held onto. And the real problem with these items is that, well, they're bad. And I guess I'm supposed to believe that there's no objectivity in this discipline, but things like these make it really, really, really hard. So yes, between me and you guys, these things are bad. And they're not just bad because they lack good storytelling or sensitivity to detail or thoughtful execution. They're bad because of where they're going. And they're going there, to the landfill, for two reasons. The first and the more obvious reason is that they're not physically long-lasting. They break or they fall apart over time because they're cheap or because their production system is not very well rationalized. But the second reason, and the more poisonous reason in my opinion, is that they're not long-lasting culturally. And just to briefly explain what I mean by that, let's look at these two clocks. So here are two different clocks that require roughly the same materials, the same effort, and the same amount of money to manufacture. This clock, I'm pointing at the one that I'm obviously pointing at, will only last as long as the Minions craze does. I think it's over, actually. If it even functions that long. But clearly nobody's going to be handing this clock down to their children or grandchildren. I'm pretty certain. Whereas this one, on the other hand, has stood the withstood the test of several decades and appears no less relevant today than it did when it was designed and released in 1982. So again, this is how I felt when I finished school. There were a lot of bad things, and there were not very many good things. And I really didn't know anything about the market or how to make something saleable or anything. They don't always teach this in design school. And so I at first focused exclusively on figuring out a system to mass produce things that fit my description of a good object. And I called this method backward design. And backward design isn't a patented proprietary technique or anything, and we're definitely not the only ones who work in this way, but we got to writing it down, and we've come to find it very, very useful. So in a conventional design process, a designer will often start by deciding what kind of product they want to make, and then what shape they want for that product to be, and then what material that product will be, and at the very, 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 very end, work with a factory to figure out how to make that thing. But the problem with this sequence is that the result is almost always compromised by the constraints of the manufacturing process. Because at the end of the day, what are the chances that a designer can predict the strengths and limitations of a factory that is most likely across the planet? So backward design, conversely, is about starting the design process not with a drawing or a model or even an intended product category necessarily, but instead with a factory. So now I'm going to walk you through the 5 steps of backward design, and we'll use the creation of one of Good Things products as an example. So step 1 is to observe. And we start the design process with something that exists, something we've seen in the world, and something that we know can be made with efficiency. And we're interested in this object because it's interesting. And because it feels as though there might be more that we can do with this process than has already necessarily been done. And so this is a starting point, and it can be really, literally anything at all. An inflatable tube person, the mesh that protects fruits and vegetables at the supermarket. Really, it can be whatever, but for the purpose of this example, we're going to start with a terracotta planter. And at this first observational stage, there's really no intent whatsoever. The goal is not to have this design end up a planter. We're just starting with one. And that brings us to step 2, which is research. And the goal with this step is to find out more about the object that we've selected. And of course, there's some conventional internet research here. But the more exciting and the more important part is physical research. And this is where we really get to play. So it involves experimenting with the object to understand its properties firsthand. Breaking it, dissecting it, sometimes even attempting to recreate it. But the result at the end of the step is a much more intimate understanding of the object and how it works. And there's really always more to a simple thing than meets the eye. And in the case of the planter, what we found is that the material, terracotta, is hygroscopic, which means that its pores can absorb and adsorb moisture. There's a different definition there if you want. Here's a definition of adsorb. It's a real word. And this is really great for plants, since the planter can absorb excess moisture and gradually release it back into the plant as needed or into the air if it's not needed. And even though it may be one of the very most ordinary objects out there, the archetypal terracotta planter is really incredible for this reason. And that takes us now to step 3, which is to communicate. And this is where we really deviate from a more conventional design process, because as opposed to hammering out a design in great detail and subsequently looking for a factory or craftsperson that can make it, this step is about creating a dialogue wherein the material, the manufacturing technique, and the people, the individual people who would be involved in the production of that object, help to determine its final form. So at this point in the process, we know that terracotta does an excellent job of absorbing and adsorbing moisture. And we had the idea to harness this strength to make an umbrella stand, which is obviously no stranger to moisture. And with crude but communicative sketches, we sent our production supervisor, Louis, to find a factory in China. That's his Facebook photo. There's Louis. And Louis visited the local craft school outside Shenzhen and asked for their very best ceramics graduate. And ultimately, this was how we found our factory. So in dialogue with Louis and our new vendor, we very quickly learned a lot about what we could, but much more importantly, what we could not do in terracotta. And believe me, there's an awful lot that cannot be done in terracotta. So going through our sketches, we learned what was wrong with just about every direction that we had come up with. They were too delicate, or the tolerances were too tight, or the parts were impossible to cast without destroying the mold every time. And we found pretty quickly that it really pays to have the best ceramic school graduate in Shenzhen. And now that brings us to step 4, where we finally get to experiment. So working with the factory, the idea here is to try stuff. And we try what we think is going to work. We try what we think is not going to work. But what's most important is that we simultaneously have an idea of what we want to make and the open-mindedness to learn something that could take the product in a completely different direction. So in the case of the planter, for example, we experimented with the material long enough to learn that there's no way to simultaneously maintain the absorbent properties of terracotta and to prevent minerals from being separated from the water and telegraphed or leached through the surface onto the outside of the vessel. And that's called efflorescence. I think it's our last dictionary word today. And here is what it looks like on a planter. Of course, you've seen it. So clearly this on an umbrella stand would compete with the longevity of the object. And so we came up with a double-walled design that would simultaneously suspend and hide the umbrella compartment, keeping the efflorescence not only invisible, but also away from the floor. So that's the experimentation step. And it's not about a vendor taking whatever steps are required to recreate your drawing. It's about a designer responding to the vendor and the medium in general to create an object that is entirely harmonious with its production. OK, finally, step 5 is to refine. And this step is fairly straightforward, but unbelievably important. And it's no longer about freedom or about open-mindedness, but at this point, we're looking for control. And the step starts with a final round of drawings, no more sketches, no more experiments, but intricate, detailed models and drawings of how we want the end result to be, with dimensions, tolerances, really the whole works. Here's one of the drawings. And this is the first moment in the process where we're exerting pressure back toward the factory. So reviewing sample after sample, we're pushing to solve the most intricate problems with the product. How can we get the form to be as precise as we want it to be? How do we control the color? And of course, since a good thing, we're responsible not only for designing the object or producing it, but also shipping and distributing it, how do we get it to our customers? That was a hard one. So hundreds of cracked, broken, discolored, and otherwise unsatisfactory samples later, and a handful of drop tests, I should say, and a production run. The Arid umbrella stand was born. And so there you have it, an umbrella stand designed completely backward. And again, what's so different here is that we're not starting with a fixed idea of what we need to make and then squeezing all of the other factors to come together so that we can make this painstaking replica of whatever our theoretical vision was. We're approaching the design with the openness to see the object influenced by these factors and ultimately made better for it. OK, so now we're going to go back to the narrative. So I figured out backward design, which is a very good way to make a good object. But that's really only half the battle, because as we remember from our Venn diagram, most good objects are not also good products. And as I said before, when I figured out backward design, I didn't know very much about making things marketable. And I guess I should add now that I really did not very much want to. Because for me, chasing after marketability would see me land exactly where I didn't want to be. So we made some rules for choosing products at Good Thing, and these were the rules that we would never, ever, 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 ever break. And no matter how many units we could sell by breaking them, we promised we would never break these rules. And here are those rules. Rule number 1 was that we would never make things shaped like other things. And we've seen a few of those, of course, maybe more than a few. And the second rule was that we would never make objects with text on them. And that's my favorite one. And we know these pretty well. I like that one, too. And the reason for these rules was that for us, these were the hallmarks of a bad object. And I would see these two traits in every single consumer product that I hated. And if you've ever been to New York Now, the gift show, at the Javits Center, you've probably seen what I'm talking about. But after years and years and years of, no, that was too many yearses. I'm not that old. Years after years of showing our products at New York Now and practically living at the Javits Center, I came to an understanding of why these two characteristics are so common. And the answer is pretty simple. Customers are not designers. And it's very hard for a consumer to relate personally to a manufacturing process, and people don't normally choose their objects to make a critical statement about design theory. En masse, people choose their objects because they like simple to understand things that do what they're supposed to do and aren't too expensive. So what do we do with that piece of information as a person who's wired to try and make things that are good objects? And are good products and good objects really mutually exclusive? And it wasn't really until we accidentally broke one of our super golden sacred rules that I realized how to make these two sets of values coexist. So in 2016, we released the Frank tray, which was designed by my friend and former professor, Chris Spies. And the Frank tray, first and foremost, is a really great example of something designed backward. The product is all about creating a new application for the curvy pressed metal detail that we often see in industrial dustpans. Here's the mold that we used to stamp it, by the way, photographed by Lewis. And the Frank tray benefits from its use of backward design in a very big way. Its form and its production process are exceptionally harmonious, and the result is something very well made, interesting, and both physically and we hope culturally long-lasting. So somehow, in addition to all of those things, as if by some miracle of nature, the Frank tray also looks quite a bit like a hot dog tray. And keep in mind, we hadn't yet named this product when we figured this out. But this was extremely exciting for us. Because there it is. It's a thing that looks like another thing, but somehow it's still not terrible. And it was with the creation of the Frank tray that we realized that those golden rules are not unbreakable, but actually bad. And the problem with things shaped like other things is not that their shape resembles that of another thing. It's that their shape resembles that of another thing only, and that their shape resembles that of another thing for no good reason. But in the Frank tray, somehow we arrived at a wonderful reason for this familiar form. And it's simultaneously a good object, beautiful, interesting, reliable, and accessible, and a good product, recognizable, easy to make, novel, and inexpensive. And it worked. People who love design buy the Frank tray. People who don't know or care about design buy the Frank tray. And we've sold many thousands of Frank trays. And once we learned to break our first cardinal rule with Chris, we brought in the English product designer Jasper Morrison to break the second. So it's a bar of soap, and it's a product with text on it. So these 4 bars are molded as one piece, and they're broken apart for individual use. But the text is not, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. It's actually pretty far from an afterthought. It's a very critical part of the product's visual semantics. So it refers to this very long-standing convention of molding a brand's name into a bar of soap. OK, so this is not to say that everything we make will now either be shaped like something else or have text on it. But clearly there are other ways to make something commercial. But the big and exciting realization here is that it's not what a product is trying to achieve that makes it a good or bad object. It is how we develop and execute that intention that can bring these completely disparate audiences together. And before I go, I thought I would end with the very first original outline from this lecture. That's it. Thanks, guys.